In the late 1400s, Europe was afraid of everything it could not control. Crops failed, children died suddenly, storms destroyed entire villages in a single night. And when people couldn't explain it, they blamed the devil. But fear alone wasn't enough. Fear needed a shape. It needed rules. It needed a manual. That manual would appear in 1487, a thick Latin volume with a cold, heavy title, Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. On its pages, priests and judges would find answers to questions no one should ever ask. How do you recognize a witch? How do you question her? How do you break her will? And how do you justify all of this in the name of God? For almost 200 years, this book would travel from city to city, from monastery to courthouse, from whispered rumor to legal authority. And behind it all, in the shadows of its pages, stood one man, a German Dominican inquisitor named Heinrich Kramer, the man who believed he was fighting the devil, even as he slowly became the instrument of something far darker than he imagined. Heinrich Kramer was not born a monster. He was born into the church. From early on, he was described as intelligent, disciplined, obsessed with doctrine. He memorized scripture, devoured theology, and became an inquisitor, a man whose job was to protect the purity of the faith. But something in Kramer changed over the years. He didn't just see heresy in books or ideas. He began to see it in faces, in people, especially in women. For Kramer, the world was divided into two camps. On one side, Christ, the church, and obedient souls. On the other, witches, demons, and hidden enemies. He traveled across German-speaking lands, investigating villages, interrogating suspects, sending some to execution. Each case seemed to confirm his belief the devil was everywhere. In confessions, forced or true, he heard the same patterns: night meetings in forests, strange ointments and powders, whispers of familiar spirits, blasphemous rituals in ruined chapels. To local priests and even some bishops, these were exaggerations, misunderstandings, or the products of fear and rumor. But to Kramer, they were proof. Proof that Christendom was under attack. The more resistance he met from church authorities, the more isolated he felt. When a bishop dismissed his accusations as hysteria, Kramer wrote angrily that such men were blind shepherds, unable to see the wolves among their flock. And in that isolation, obsession grew. He no longer wanted to simply report the presence of witches. He wanted to define them, to write down their nature, their methods, their weaknesses. He wanted to turn fear into a system. And systems can be copied, printed, and spread. According to later accounts, Heinrich Kramer did not write Malleus Maleficarum in a comfortable study. He wrote it in a cell, a small, stone-walled room in a monastery somewhere in the Holy Roman Empire, a place meant for silence, prayer, and contemplation. Instead, it became a workshop for a manual of persecution. At night, Kramer would sit at a wooden desk lit by a single candle. On the table, ink, quills, scraps of parchment filled with notes from trials. Outside, the world slept. Inside, he assembled fragments of fear into chapters. He collected testimonies of accused women, local folk beliefs, old demonology texts, legal procedures from inquisitorial courts, and he fused them into one narrative. The world is under attack. Witches are real, and this is how you find them. Some later legends claim that during the writing of the book, Kramer began to experience strange phenomena. The candle flame would lean sideways when there was no wind. He would hear footsteps in the corridor, but when he opened the door, the hallway was empty. On at least one occasion, a page he thought he had not yet written appeared already filled with text in his own handwriting, though he had no memory of writing it. Of course, history cannot confirm these stories, but they survived in the margins of the book's reputation, whispered like a curse. He did not write it alone. Whether he was driven by God, by his own obsession, or by something darker, one thing is certain. When he was finished, he held in his hands not just a book, but a weapon. Open Malleus Maleficarum, and it does not start with stories. It starts with arguments. Kramer knew his work would be questioned by bishops, by scholars, by judges. So first, he set out to prove a single point: witches are real, and they are worse than you think. The book explains, step by step, why the devil can make pacts with humans, why God allows such evil to exist, why witches, especially women, are more vulnerable to demonic influence, then it moves to something more dangerous: practical instructions. How to recognize a witch. According to the book, witches might cause storms and hail to destroy crops, make men impotent or infertile, steal newborn children, or milk, spread disease among animals, use objects, dolls, hair, wax figures, to curse their victims. But the most insidious part was not the list of powers. It was the list of signs. Suspicious signs, according to Kramer, could include a woman who lived alone, a midwife who was present at many births, a neighbor often accused of bringing misfortune, someone disliked, gossiped about, or simply different. The book explains that witches will deny everything, that their tears, their fear, their prayers are all a performance. In other words, if a woman was accused, her innocence could be used as proof of guilt. Kramer wrapped all of this in theology and legal reasoning. He used scripture, church fathers, and canon law to make the book look respectable, almost scholarly. But underneath the Latin, one thing pulsed steadily: fear. Fear turned into procedure. One of the most disturbing parts of Malleus Maleficarum is its description of how witches allegedly made pacts with the devil. Kramer writes as if he has personally witnessed it many times. First, he says, the devil does not appear as a monster. He appears as a shadow in the corner of a room, as a man in dark clothing, as a familiar voice in a dream. He offers small favors: revenge against someone who hurt you, protection from hunger, money, beauty, or forbidden knowledge. Then the bargain deepens. According to the book, the ritual pact often involves renouncing the faith, spitting on a crucifix, or trampling on a sacred object, swearing loyalty to the devil, receiving a mark, a small, insensitive spot on the skin, where the devil allegedly touched or bit the person. Kramer describes gatherings, Sabbaths, held at night in fields or ruined chapels. There, witches are said to meet demons in disguise, feast on unholy food, and mock religious ceremonies. Children are supposedly offered, sacraments are parroted, oaths are renewed. Historically, we know that many of these details were forced out of victims under torture, shaped by the expectations of their interrogators. But in Malleus Maleficarum, they are presented as facts: cold, precise, undeniable. For a reader in the 1500s, this section did something devastating. It made the devil's world feel organized, structured, everywhere. If you believe this book, then every misfortune, every accident, every unexplained illness could be traced back to a secret pact. And once people start believing that, they start looking for someone to blame. Before Malleus Maleficarum, there were accusations of sorcery, yes. Trials happened. Some ended in execution. But after the book spread, something changed. Persecution became systematic. The printing press had just begun to transform Europe, and Malleus Maleficarum was perfectly timed. It was printed, copied, translated, carried from city to city. Judges who had never met Heinrich Kramer could still use his words. Priests who had never seen a witch trial could suddenly feel like experts. The book gave them a list of crimes to look for, a checklist of questions to ask, a spiritual justification for almost any measure they chose to use. Confessions obtained under torture were confirmed by the book. The book was confirmed by those confessions. A perfect circle. In some regions, accusations exploded. A child fell ill. A cow died suddenly. A storm destroyed only one man's field. Someone must have done it. Someone who, according to the hammer of witches, already fit the picture: the widow, the midwife, the strange neighbor, the woman who spoke too much or too little. Over the next 2 centuries, tens of thousands of people, mostly women, would be investigated, tortured, and killed as witches in Europe. Not all because of this single book. Many other forces were at play. Political tensions, religious wars, economic crises, local superstitions, but Malleus Maleficarum acted as a match thrown into a field of dry grass. It did not create the fear. It organized it, sharpened it, legitimized it. And once fear is given rules, it becomes very difficult to stop. Here is the irony. Many today imagine Malleus Maleficarum as an official, blessed handbook of the Catholic Church. It wasn't. In fact, from very early on, some church authorities were deeply uneasy about it. Heinrich Kramer wanted his book to be seen as an extension of church power. He claimed support, borrowed the names of respected theologians, and presented himself as a defender of orthodoxy. But when higher authorities actually looked at his work, some were alarmed. They saw extreme statements about women and their weakness, a dangerous overuse of torture legal procedures that twisted canon law, a theology that seemed more driven by fear than by truth. Some bishops refused to let Kramer continue his witch trials. Certain theologians criticized the book quietly, calling it excessive, unbalanced, even the work of a man obsessed. Later, the book would appear on lists of works the church did not recommend. But by then it was too late. Because books, once printed and spread, do not obey their creators. They live their own lives in the hands of readers. Local judges, secular courts, and zealous priests often cared less about official approval and more about having a tool, something that told them they were righteous, something that told them they were fighting evil. Malleus Maleficarum gave them exactly that. And so, even as some parts of the church tried to distance themselves, the book continued its quiet march across Europe. Centuries passed. The witch hunt slowed, then faded. Legal systems changed. New forms of evidence were demanded in trials. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Malleus Maleficarum was no longer a weapon. It was an artifact, a relic of a darker time. But relics can still disturb those who touch them. In the 19th century, scholars began to study the book not as a manual, but as a psychological and historical puzzle. Some reported something strange, that reading it for too long made them feel watched. Not by demons or witches, but by the book itself. Page after page of detailed cruelty, legal, structured, justified, created an atmosphere that was difficult to shake off. One researcher wrote in his diary that after days of working through the Latin text, he began to dream of courtrooms with no exits, of judges without faces, of women crying out but making no sound. Another claimed that the margins of his copy sometimes seemed darker, as if the ink refused to age like ordinary words. Over time, a legend grew, that Malleus Maleficarum was not just a description of fear, but a carrier of it. That any mind which stared too long into its logic of suspicion and violence risked being pulled into the same spiral as its author. Of course, to a modern historian, these are only stories, the natural reaction of people spending too much time inside a very dark text.